full accountability. The report also documents public punishments, torture and unlawful killings executed by Hamas in Gaza. This terror regime is inflicting trauma on a population already deeply affected by war and humanitarian crisis. Norway thanks the COI for also addressing the notable increase in Israeli civilians killed and injured by Palestinian armed groups in 2023. President, Norway reaffirms our unwavering commitment to a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the two-state solution. How can this Council reinforce its efforts to address what seems to be a systematic erosion of human rights in Palestine, for which settler violence, the introduction of the death penalty in practice targeting just Palestinians, the mistreatment and lack of due process for Palestinian detainees in Israeli prisons are grave but not exclusive examples? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you. Mr. President, South Africa welcomes the report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel. We note with grave concern that the expansion of Israeli settlements continues despite the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion, and that settler violence against Palestinians, particularly women and children, persists. Palestinian children exposed to such violence suffer invisible harms, instilling daily fear and undermining their development and well-being. South Africa unequivocally condemns the use of sexual violence to instill fear and humiliate Palestinians. International law, including the 4th Geneva Convention and human rights treaties, strictly prohibits sexual violence as a form of torture, cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment, and as a war crime. While Israeli authorities have acknowledged settler violence as a problem, structural conditions promoting impunity persist. Accountability for perpetrators remains elusive, and indoctrination of children in outposts perpetuates the cycle of violence. Efforts to remove violent settlers and dismantle outposts are noted, but more robust action is required. South Africa also condemns extrajudicial executions and severe violence inflicted on Palestinians in Gaza by armed militants affiliated with Hamas, including gender-based violence, and denounces acts committed by Palestinian armed groups in the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Israel. We concur with the Commission's conclusions that Israel's conduct breaches its obligations to protect Palestinians under the 4th Geneva Convention and international human rights law. South Africa reiterates its long-standing commitment to a two-state solution and calls for renewed efforts towards a just...
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
I thank you, Mr. President. The ongoing expansion of illegal settlements, the daily escalation of settler violence in the West Bank, and the severe ongoing humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip are direct results of an entrenched policy that denies a captive population their basic rights. As a nation that endured a bitter struggle for its own independence, Eritrea views the question of Palestine through the immutable lens of decolonization and the right of peoples to self-determination. Peace cannot be achieved through collective punishment. The enforcement of apartheid-like policies, the annihilation of an entire population, or the permanent displacement of Palestinians from their ancestral lands. While we took note of the report's focus on violations by all sides, the international community must not create a false equivalence. The primary legal obligation to end the violence rests with the occupying power. We reiterate that any lasting solution requires the immediate implementation of the International Courts of Justice advisory opinions, a total halt to settlement activities, and the end of the unlawful blockade of essential humanitarian relief. Eritrea reaffirms its unwavering solidarity with the Palestinian people. Real stability in the Middle East will remain elusive until this historic injustice is corrected through the establishment of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bangladesh.
Mr. President, Bangladesh thanks the Commission of Inquiry for its report and for its work under difficult and highly constrained circumstances. Bangladesh remains gravely concerned by the Commission's findings on killings and patterns of organized attacks, shootings, arson, intimidation, sexual violence, and child-targeted harms by the occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territory. We are particularly concerned by the Commission's conclusion that settler violence functions as an instrument of annexation, serving to entrench settlements and displace Palestinians from their land. Bangladesh reiterates that the occupation, continued settlement expansion, and the denial of Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination remain at the root of the crisis. Israel, the occupying power, must comply fully with the international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And the unlawful occupation cease all settlement activities and protect civilians and ensure accountability. We call for full cooperation with the international accountability mechanisms, including the ICC, and urge all states to refrain from aiding or abetting violations of international law. Finally, Bangladesh reaffirms its unwavering support for the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people and for an end to Israel's occupation. A just and lasting peace can only be achieved through the establishment of a sovereign and independent state of Palestine along the pre-1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
President, Peru would like to thank the Independent International Commission of Inquiry for the submission of the report. We take note with concern of its findings on the violations of international human rights law in the occupied Palestinian territory. In particular, acts of forced displacement of the civilian population, particularly in Gaza, and building new settlements which are contrary to international law. Peru would restate that all parties must fully respect their international obligations, and that the protection of the civilian population without any distinction must be an absolute priority. To conclude, President, Peru would restate its commitment to the unrestricted respect for international law and with a two-state solution whereby both are living in peace and security within the internationally recognized borders. Many thanks.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We welcome the report of the Commission of Inquiry, an important contribution to accountability that exposes the structural patterns of violence by Israeli settlers and other non-state actors. Brazil is deeply concerned by the unprecedented surge in Israeli settler terror in 2026, which has already left 13 Palestinians dead and nearly 500 injured. Carried out with full impunity, this systematic violence and resulting forcible displacement threaten the very survival of Palestinian communities on their land and risk facilitating ethnic cleansing. It is profoundly alarming that Israel's security forces shield settler violence instead of protecting the occupied population. Brazil reminds Israel of its obligations under the Geneva Conventions to safeguard Palestinians as protected persons. We urge the Israeli government to take immediate, effective measures to protect Palestinian civilians, especially children. Brazil reiterates its strong support for the Commission and calls on Israel to grant it unhindered access to fulfill its mandate. We remain committed to a two-state solution within an independent and viable state of Palestine living side by side with Israel in peace and security within the 1967 borders. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Commission of Inquiry for its presentation and report. Turkey remains gravely concerned by the findings in the report. The increase in illegal settlements, the surge in settler terror, and Israel's attempts to create fait accompli at the Muslim and Christian holy sites scuttle all peace efforts. In Gaza, there are continuous Israeli violations. The humanitarian situation calls for immediate, unrestricted access and launching of recovery and reconstruction efforts. Urgent measures are needed to protect the civilians. We also categorically reject Israeli attempts towards annexation and occupation in Lebanon. Israel's continuous attacks risk unraveling Lebanese security and stability. Mr. President, Israeli policies have become the main cause of regional insecurity. At the root of the problem is the strategy of Israel to ensure its security at the expense of and not in conjunction with the security and stability of its neighbors and the region. At the core lie the illegal occupation of Palestinian territories. The cure remains the two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein.
President, Liechtenstein thanks the Commission of Inquiry for the presentation of its report and for its continued work. The report confronts us with a sobering reality. Palestinian civilians find themselves trapped between two sources of grave harm. In Gaza, Palestinian civilians face severe violence at the hands of Hamas, while Israeli military operations continue. The humanitarian situation remains dire, and safe, rapid and unimpeded access for humanitarian actors and aid must be ensured. In the West Bank, Palestinians are subject to extremist settler violence, with increased killings of civilians, including women and children, rising to deeply disturbing levels, and in contravention of Israel's obligation under international law. At the same time, Israeli civilians have likewise been subjected to killings and grave bodily harm by Hamas. Mr. President, the adoption of a discriminatory death penalty bill marks a grave regression from Israel's own commitments. Liechtenstein rejects death penalty in any circumstance. In the long run, the realization of the Palestinian right to self-determination and a two-state solution is the only viable way for a peaceful, stable and sustainable solution for the region, and we call on all parties to resume credible political deliberations to this end. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the UK.
Thank you, Mr. President. We continue to regret that the Commission of Inquiry was established on an open-ended basis. Nevertheless, the UK remains committed to upholding human rights and recognises the value of proportionate scrutiny of allegations of violations and abuses by all parties in Israel and Palestine. The humanitarian situation in Gaza remains intolerable. Urgent action is needed to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance. All parties must comply with IHL, including on the protection of civilians and humanitarian personnel and the principle of distinction. We are also deeply concerned by the deteriorating situation in the West Bank, including continued settler violence, illegal settlement expansion, and ongoing demolitions and displacement. The UK has taken action, including through sanctions and guidance to UK businesses to deter and counter support for illegal settlements and those responsible for related violence. The UK continues to support efforts to restore and sustain a ceasefire, including the disarmament of Hamas and an end to its control of Gaza, and a return to a credible political process toward a two-state solution, delivering lasting peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike. What steps does the Commission see as most effective in advancing accountability and addressing the drivers of violence? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal.
Portugal thanks the Commission of Inquiry for its report and expresses grave concern regarding its findings. Amid continued violence and forced displacement, civilians are left in increasingly precarious conditions and exposed to human rights violations. We are particularly alarmed by the reported escalation of settler violence in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, marked by attacks that have further deepened insecurity and fear among Palestinian people. All parties are bound by international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Israel, as the occupying power, is under the obligation to ensure the protection of the occupied population, as reaffirmed by an International Court of Justice. Portugal views with particular concern the adoption of the death penalty bill by Israel, an acceptable form of punishment that undermines the inherent dignity of human life with reported discriminatory implications. Portugal calls for the full implementation of the ceasefire by all parties and remains firmly committed to a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the two-state solution, while urging all parties to refrain from unilateral actions that could undermine peace efforts. Distinguished members of the Commission, could you further reflect on how the immediate harm caused by settler violence may translate into long-term psychological impacts on children? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Sayyid Rais.
Mr. President, the situation in the OPT are of grave concern, considering the increase in attacks by extremist settlers against the Palestinians. We condemn the illegal measures that directly undermine the two-state solution. We reiterate our refusal of any measures that aim at annexation, including a systematic expansion of settlements and imposing what's called Israeli sovereignty, and establishing an infrastructure that aim at changing the demographic and territorial changes. Our stance is clear. Any kind of annexation is a breach of international law. In conclusion, we reaffirm our commitment to support any effort aimed at achieving a comprehensive peace on the basis of the two-state solution, to end the cycle of violence and to establish a sovereign Palestinian state living side by side with Israel in peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Thank you, President. Belgium welcomes the focus of the Commission's timely report. We express grave concern at the finding that severe physical and psychological harm, including killings perpetrated against civilians by violent Israeli settlers and Palestinian armed groups such as Hamas, is on the rise. These criminal acts and the pervasive impunity surrounding them must cease immediately. We call on all parties to collaborate with the Commission and other relevant UN entities and the ICC in this regard. Full respect of international law is also required with regard to the situation in the OPT itself, in line with the ICJ advisory opinion. In the meantime, Belgium and the EU have imposed additional targeted sanctions against violent settlers in the West Bank and against Hamas leaders. In our national capacity, we have also declared Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, as well as the political and military leaders of Hamas, persona non grata. Belgium also decided to expand its current prohibition of arms export. Belgium remains firmly committed to a two-state solution, the only viable path for Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in lasting peace, security and dignity. We therefore call for full respect of the ceasefire and effective implementation of Resolution 2803, including the disarmament of Hamas and the withdrawal of Israeli military forces from Gaza. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the Commission of Inquiry for its work. 3 points from our side. First, on Gaza. Germany reiterates its condemnation of Hamas's terrorist attacks and calls for the permanent disarmament of Hamas and other non-state armed groups. Germany calls on Israel to ensure that sufficient aid reaches civilians in Gaza and that the rehabilitation of humanitarian infrastructure starts immediately. Second, regarding the West Bank, Germany reiterates its call on Israel to end expansion of settlements and administrative powers, prevent and ensure accountability for unprecedented levels of settler violence, as well as to investigate allegations against Israeli forces, including in detention facilities. We strongly oppose any calls for annexation and forcible displacement of the Palestinian population and reaffirm our commitment to a lasting peace based on a negotiated two-state solution. Third, on Lebanon, we call on all parties to respect humanitarian law, ensure the protection of civilians, and return to the agreed-upon ceasefire and work towards a lasting peace. In closing, we welcome the announcement of an agreement between the United States and Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mauritania.
Thank you. President Mauritania would like to thank the Commission of Inquiry for the submission of its report. We have looked very carefully at the findings of this report, particularly reference to the escalating violence on the part of settlers in the West Bank, including in East Jerusalem, and the impact that it has on Palestinian civilians. It also shows that these attacks are not isolated incidents, but are part and parcel of a policy, a colonial expansionist policy, forced displacement, depriving Palestinians of their right to self-determination. We also condemn all practices in the report which are serious violations of humanitarian and international human rights law. A serious approach needs to be mindful of the causes of this state of affairs, namely the maintenance of Israel's occupation and the illegal expansionist approach. We need accountability and recall our principled position supporting the Palestinian people, including their right to establishing their own sovereign state on the basis of the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as a capital in line with the relevant resolutions.
Representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Korea thanks the Commission of Inquiry for its report and takes note of its findings. We remain deeply concerned by the continued deterioration of the human rights and humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, including increasing violence in the West Bank and the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, which requires sustained international attention amid ongoing tensions across the Middle East. The Commission's findings regarding the sharp increase in settler violence in the West Bank are deeply troubling. We call on Israel to reverse its decisions related to settlement expansion and take effective measures to prevent and address settler violence. We also note with concern the Commission's findings concerning executions, torture, and other abuses committed by Palestinian armed groups in Gaza, as well as killings and attacks against Israeli civilians by Palestinian armed groups and individuals. All parties must fully comply with their obligations under international law, and we hope that further progress in the implementation of the ceasefire agreement will contribute to improving the situation. The Republic of Korea reaffirms committed to the two-state solution and will continue to support efforts aimed at alleviating civilian sufferings and restoring peace and stability in the region. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela.
Thank you, President. Regrettably, we yet again listen to a report which testifies to the worsening situation of human rights imposed by Israel against the civilians in Palestine. Despite the ceasefire, there is still violence. We're seeing an increase in murders, forced displacement, people who are detained without trial, people who have been abducted, disappeared persons, a population which is constantly suffering as if they weren't entitled to the right to life, incalculable harm done to the civilian infrastructure, health centres, schools, etc. The acts of violence increase in plain view of the international community. We are seeing a dangerous normalisation of this violation of international humanitarian law and the UN Charter. Yet again, we demand a ceasefire. It's vital that we guarantee the protection of human rights as well as the integrity of the Palestinian people given this terrible criminal siege. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Yemen.
السيد الرئيس اطلعت بلادي على ما ورد في تقرير لجنة.
President, we studied the report of the Commission of Inquiry, and we strongly condemn the violations committed against the Palestinian people, especially the targeting of civilians, the large-scale destructions, and also the forced displacement, as well as other practices that lead to an unprecedented level of suffering. All of this is happening without any accountability and leads to impunity. This is why we recall the importance to support the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry and the need to establish truth and facts and recall the importance of accountability. We call upon the International Court to take the relevant measures to guarantee the protection of civilians and guarantee the respect of international law and guarantee Palestinian rights to enjoy their legitimate rights, especially the right to self-determination.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, President. We thank the COI for its important report. While accountability for all violations is essential, we reject any narrative that equates perpetrators of grave international crimes with the population subjected to systematic oppression or peoples exercising their right to resist. We further draw the attention of the Commission and the Council to the extension of the same pattern of conduct to southern Lebanon. The systematic destruction of civilian homes, agricultural lands, water infrastructure, and essential services, coupled with the measures preventing the return of predominantly Shia communities, constitute the deliberate infliction of the conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the protected group in whole or in part within the meaning of Article 2C of Geneva's Genocide Convention. Therefore, the specific intent, dulus specialis, to destroy the Shia community as a protected group is established and confirming the criminal pattern of Israeli regime's senior official under Article 6, 7.1d and 7.1h of the Rome Statute. While the Commission's mandate currently focuses on the OPT, the prevention of the further ethnic cleansing in Lebanon necessitates either the establishment of similar mechanism or extension of the Commission's mandate in line with the preventive objective of paragraph 1 of HRC resolution 830/1. I thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon.
Mr. Chair, Lebanon commends the Commission of Inquiry's sustained efforts to document and preserve the factual records of violations. We express our full solidarity with the Palestinians and the hardships they endure. We also thank states, United Nations entities and humanitarian partners that provide vital assistance under extremely difficult circumstances. Year after year, report after report, however, the situation remains unchanged. Israel's continued occupation, settlers' violence, expansion of illegal settlements, widespread destruction and displacement. Palestinians continue to face a broad and persistent pattern of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law that affects every aspect of civilian life. These practices undermine the right of Palestinians to self-determination and further erode prospects for political solutions. The principles of international law are clear. The challenge facing the international community is no longer to identify violations, but to ensure Israel's full compliance with international obligations and the implementation of recommendations issued by international accountability mechanisms. The continued failure to seize these violations and to hold perpetrators accountable allowed Israel to persist in attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructures, acts of destruction, forced displacement and disregard for international law. The same patterns have extended beyond the occupied Palestinian territory and have directly impacted and targeted Lebanon.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Netherlands.
Mr. President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the members of the Commission of Inquiry for their presentation and take note of the report on killings and acts causing bodily and mental harm to non-state actors in the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel. The report of the Commission of Inquiry paints a disheartening picture of the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. Regarding Gaza, the Kingdom of the Netherlands reiterates its call for the full implementation by all parties of the ceasefire and all other provisions of Security Council Resolution 2803. Hamas and other non-state armed groups must disarm. Innocent civilians have become victims of violence and executions by these groups. This is unacceptable, and the Kingdom of the Netherlands continues to look for ways to sanction those involved. We reiterate that Hamas and other non-state armed groups cannot play a role in the future governance of Gaza. The report also demonstrates that settler violence in the West Bank has become an everyday reality. Settlements and their expansion contravene international law. We call therefore on Israel to end its expansion of settlements, ensure accountability for settler violence, including to investigate allegations against Israeli forces. The Kingdom of the Netherlands continues to work on sanctions against violent settlers. We oppose those who argue for annexation and forcible displacement of the Palestinian population. I thank you.
Thank you. This was the last speaker that we could accommodate. We will now turn to our list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. And I give the floor to the representative of the Jerusalem Institute of Justice.
Mr. President, we address this Council today with grave concern over the bias and methodological distortions in the Commission of Inquiry's latest report. While acknowledging the October 7 massacre and the suffering of the hostages, it treats these atrocities as footnotes. The report rightly admits that Hamas and affiliated armed groups tortured civilians, punished suspected opponents without trial, and used hospitals for coercion and abuse. These findings expose Hamas not as a resistance movement, but as a brutal authority terrorizing Israelis and Palestinians alike. Yet, even when Hamas executes Palestinians, punishes children, and weaponizes hospitals, the report finds a path back to Israel. It recasts Hamas's brutality as the product of a so-called vacuum created by Israeli actions. That premise is flawed and morally inverted. Hamas has ruled Gaza through fear and torture since 2007, as the report itself acknowledges. The pattern is unmistakable here. Hamas abuses Palestinians and terrorizes Gaza from within, yet Israel is blamed. That is not serious legal analysis. It is political framing disguised as human rights reporting, claiming to hold a terrorist organization accountable. A credible mechanism must distinguish between a sovereign democracy defending its own people and a terrorist organization committed to its destruction. We urge this Council to reject this narrative and demand factual rigor, legal precision, and moral clarity. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the Defense for Children International.
Mr. President, we draw your urgent attention to the widespread detention of Palestinian children without trial or trial. Month after month, the population and proportion of Palestinian child detainees in administrative detention is growing to all-time high record levels. Israeli prison service records for 2026 confirm that at least 350 Palestinian children are currently detained in Israeli prisons, with more than half held under administrative detention orders, meaning detention without charge. These children are detained indefinitely based on secret files, and their arbitrary detention is frequently renewed at the last minute, a deliberate practice that inflicts severe psychological torture. Detention centres have been largely isolated from the outside world as Israeli forces block access to the International Committee of the Red Cross, human rights organizations, lawyers, and families. Detainees' health deteriorates due to their policy of deliberate starvation, severe overcrowding, and gross medical neglect. These practices constitute a flagrant violation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention Against Torture, perpetrated with complete international impunity. We strongly urge all member states to demand the immediate release of all Palestinian children in Israeli detention centres, military bases, and prisons. Demand unrestricted access for lawyers and human rights organizations to meet with child prisoners, and call to reverse the Israeli instituted suspension of family visits. And use all available means to demand Israeli authorities uphold Palestinian children's rights as outlined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which the State of Israel has ratified.
I now give the floor to Isaac International.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ISAC is a youth-led organization built on the belief that every young person deserves the opportunity to develop their potential and shape a better future. But in Palestine today, that future is being destroyed. No child can learn under bombardments. No student can dream while schools are damaged, universities are closed, and families are forced to search for safety, food, and water. Education is not a privilege, it is a fundamental right. And when education is denied, an entire generation is denied the chance to rebuild, to lead, and to live with dignity. This crisis is a humanitarian tragedy and a direct attack on every promises of the Sustainable Development Goals. None of these goals can survive in a context of violence, displacement, starvation, and fear. As young people, we refuse to accept a world where a child's access to education depends on where they are born. We refuse to normalize hunger. We refuse to accept poverty, occupation, and insecurity as the destiny of any people. ISAC calls for the protection of civilians, unrestricted humanitarian access, the protection of schools and universities, and a renewed commitment to peace, dignity, and human rights. Young people in Palestine, as everywhere, have a right to learn, to live free from hunger and poverty, and to build a better future with peace and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the Palestinian Initiative for the Promotion of Global Dialogue and Democracy.
Mr. High Commissioner, distinguished members of the Council, we thank the Independent Commission of Inquiry for its continued work and welcome this report examination of violence perpetrated by settlers in the occupied Palestinian territory. We particularly welcome the Commissioner's documentation and recognition of escalating settlers' violence, which cannot be viewed in isolation of the broader context of settlement expansion, displacement, and fragmentation of Palestinian communities. The situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, reflects an accelerating Israeli-sanctioned pattern of territorial fragmentation and de facto annexation. Settlement expansion, movement restrictions, and coercive practices deepen dispossession and undermine the territorial contiguity of the OPT. Settlers' violence is not isolated but enabled by these policies, which also undermine accountability and contribute to the persistence of violations against Palestinians, including administrative detention without charge or trial against women, children, and students in degrading conditions. In Gaza, the scale of destruction has resulted in catastrophic humanitarian conditions, including the collapse of health system and severe reproductive harm. Mr. High Commissioner, these patterns underscore the need to move beyond documentation toward accountability. We call for sustained international monitoring, independent investigation, and measures to ensure compliance with international humanitarian and human rights law, including attention to gender harms. Thank you.
I give the floor to the Palestinian Return Center.
The Palestinian Return Center thanks the High Commissioner for his report. Further to the High Commissioner's findings, we wanted to highlight increased settler violence in the Palestinian Governorate of Jenin, an area within the West Bank that falls under Area A of the Oslo Accord, legally recognizing it as Palestinian land. In February 2026, Israeli authorities confiscated over 26,000 dunams of land in Jenin under Military Order 26/15, demolishing 14 residential structures, seizing 46 properties with a documented 43 settler attacks. In April 2026, the Higher Planning Council of the Israeli Civil Administration approved 126 new illegal settler housing units in Sanur, an area within the northern Palestinian region of the West Bank, which was formally evacuated under the disengagement plan in 2005. Israeli official Smotrich publicly declared that the settlement of Sanur would become an inseparable part of the map of Jewish settlements, and that is just the beginning. Statements of direct intent to continue the illegal seizures of Palestinian lands to render the very foundations of a viable Palestinian state impossible. We urge member states to investigate and prosecute under domestic or universal jurisdiction individuals and organizations that are suspected of violence against Palestinians and the expanding settlement enterprise.
I give the floor to the representative of Al-Haq, Law in the Service of Man.
Mr. President, the deeply alarming pattern of settler violence we are witnessing must be understood as a means and method of implementing Israel's Zionist goal of Palestinian erasure. Since the beginning of 2026, nearly 1,500 attacks have been documented, targeting individuals, homes, agricultural land, and livelihoods. Organized groups of armed settlers, expanding their illegal presence in Palestine in direct defiance of the ICJ's July 2024 advisory opinion, are employing lethal force and aggressive intimidation tactics, often targeting entire communities. Illegal outposts, once a tool of land control and appropriation, have evolved into operational hubs for attacks. Incidents that begin as property seizures, such as livestock theft, now frequently lead to the fatal injury and killing of Palestinians. Serving as a tool of territorial consolidation that entrenches apartheid, these acts drive mass forcible displacement, especially of pastoral and Bedouin communities. The scale, organisation and persistence of this violence and its clear facilitation by the state further attest to its role in advancing Israel's annexation of Palestine and destruction of its people. The consequences of systematically targeting, dispossessing and depriving Palestinians of their means of survival are not only humanitarian, they're existential. Before our eyes, Palestinians endure an ongoing genocide met with global complicity. Meaningful international action is both overdue and urgently required. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the European Centre for Law and Justice.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The Commission of Inquiry cannot continue to willfully ignore the overwhelming evidence supporting and documenting the vast sexual atrocities committed by Hamas and other terrorists in Gaza on October 7th and beyond. Not only were these crimes documented and widely reported in the media and even in a UN mission report, but a recent report by an independent nonprofit gives detailed documentation and evidence of the same, concluding that the attack was a coordinated assault in which sexual violence was used to terrorize victims, families, communities, and society at large, and that sexual and gender-based violence formed a central component of the October 7th attack and of the hostages in captivity. Despite the abundance of credible evidence, the Commission has chosen to disregard these findings, apparently because they conflict with its predetermined narrative. The sheer weight of documented proof now compels the Commission to rectify its prior reports, which unjustly condemned Israel, and to issue accurate, evidence-based findings on sexual and gender-based violence. The Commission's mandate requires it to investigate all alleged violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law by limiting its investigative focus to only certain actors and categories of undocumented violations. The Commission has acted beyond its authority and in violation of the independence, impartiality, and objectivity required of its members. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the Institute for NGO Research.
Thank you, Mr. President. It appears that the COI is finally willing to address at least some, though most remain largely ignored, of the atrocities committed by Hamas against the Palestinian people. Yet, despite its mandate, and despite the fact that it has been granted millions of taxpayer dollars to examine the root causes of the Palestinian conflict, this commission still refuses to address the elephant in the room: the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC is the primary entity driving conflict in the Middle East, and in particular, the Palestinian conflict with Israel. It has exported its millenary and genocidal ideology to Palestinian armed groups. The IRGC finances and trains Hamas combatants and disseminates its terror propaganda across the globe as part of its foreign influence ops, allowing the terrorist organization to entrench its occupation of Gaza and to commit atrocities not only against Israelis, but also Palestinians. Mr. President, why does the COI refuse to examine the role of Iran and the ruling IRGC? Why does it refuse to document its incitement of and acts of genocide? Why does it not call for boycotts and sanctions against IRGC entities and officials? Why does it not call for referral of IRGC leaders to the ICC? Why is it refusing to spend any of its vast resources to investigate the real root causes of this conflict? Thank you.
I now give the floor to the representative of the internationallawyers.org.
We thank the Commission for its report. The Commission's findings highlight Israel's failure as the occupying power to fulfill its obligations under the 4th Geneva Convention and customary international law to protect the Palestinian population and safeguard their right to life amidst genocide. As the Commission finds, settler violence in the West Bank functions as a means of implementing Israeli state policy aimed at displacing Palestinians and facilitating the annexation of territory. Israeli security forces have acted as a shield for violence, accompanying and protecting settlers during attacks against Palestinian civilians. Furthermore, Palestinians are systematically labeled as terrorists to justify the use of deadly force against them. Israel's law and institutions are insufficient to deter settler violence. Widespread impunity driven by police inaction and defiances within the justice system enables settler attacks. While settlers often face little to no accountability, Palestinians are subject to harsher treatment and a discriminatory legal system, further perpetuating inequality and violence. Accordingly, internationallawyers.org demands the end of the unlawful occupation, urges immediate measures to ensure the protection of the Palestinian people, calls on the international community to refrain from aiding or assisting this illegal situation, and urges the Commission to recognize that Israel's settler actions constitute acts contributing to the genocide being committed by Israel. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom.
thank the Commission of Inquiry for its report. Yet the genocide in Gaza continues, and atrocities against Palestinians remain normalized. Among these atrocities is sexual violence in occupied Palestine, used as a deliberate strategy of settler colonial domination. Survivors report forced nudity, sexualized threats, invasive touching, and physical assault by the Israeli military, police, and settlers. As the Commission stated, settlers have increasingly resorted to sexual violence to instill fear and humiliate Palestinian families and human rights defenders. Men, women, and children are targeted. Israeli soldiers and guards, including women, have been documented as perpetrators. This reflects a regime of bodily and reproductive injustice in which Palestinian bodies are treated as sites of punishment across checkpoints, prisons, and homes. Yet, international mechanisms often seek to validate testimonies through the very institutions accused of these harms, further silencing survivors. WILF demands recognition of this violence as an expression of settler colonialism. We call for accountability and for support to Palestinian-led documentation efforts. Justice requires dismantling the system that protects colonial legitimacy. We must move beyond criminal frameworks towards holistic approaches that restore dignity to those whose bodies have been turned into battlegrounds.
This was the last speaker we could accommodate for this dialogue. I now give the floor to the members of the Commission for the concluding remarks. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, I wish to thank each of the states as well as the non-government organizations that have offered valuable comments on the report of this Commission. I wish to reiterate the commitment of this Commission to adopting the highest standards in terms of gathering of evidence, analysis of evidence using scientific standards, acceptable to the known adjudicatory bodies, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Having said that, I would like to reiterate that Israel should permit this Commission to the territories, to access the territories, and to speak to the victims of violence so that we can have a first-hand account of all victims of all forms of violence. This Commission is working to ensure justice to all the victims, irrespective of their nationalities or the territories they belong to in these areas. So I request the State of Israel to cooperate with this Commission to carry out its mandate. I now pass the floor to Justice Mumba, my co-commissioner.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you, Chair, for this opportunity. We thank all member states and all groups who have made their statements supporting the Commission's work and challenging it in some state. While the Commission of Inquiry has a mandate, a specific mandate, to handle the atrocities that are happening in the occupied Palestinian territory, we also feel that member states have obligations. The report has been disseminated. The decision of the International Court of Justice has also been disseminated and is well understood, as cited by most of the contributing states on this fora. What is remaining is really action to deal with the perpetrators, non-state actors, Palestinian armed groups, Hamas and the Israeli forces, and institutions that are perpetrating violence in the occupied Palestinian territory. There are international instruments which oblige states to take action. Some states have mentioned about regarding sanctions against named personnel perpetrating violence and atrocities in these countries. And also, when we talk about sanctions, it's not only about against individuals, but also against the international companies that are supporting the perpetrators of violence in this region, and also institutions which operate from Israel or from other countries supporting indirectly or directly these atrocities. We maintain that the Commission is committed to its mandate and it will investigate as far as possible. But we also recognize that we have constraints and challenges in terms of time, resources, and requisite personnel to continue with these investigations and to make it clear that our mandate is doable given positive support from all member states and all those that are concerned with these deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you. A number of states in commenting asked questions, and the common theme in most of those questions was what more can be done. Ireland said, what steps can states take? Indonesia said, how can we strengthen accountability principles? New Zealand said, what more can the international community do? The United Kingdom said, what steps can be taken for countering impunity? Our Commission has now released 16 reports. We'll be releasing our 17th next week, dealing with the situation of children. And all of our reports make recommendations. We must move beyond expressing deep concern and strong condemnation to addressing the questions that these states have asked today. What more can be done? Many states referred to positive actions that have been taken, sanctions on individuals. What more can be done is to start targeting institutions, not just settlers, but settlements themselves, to prevent the transfer of financial assistance, whether through trade or donations. Many states are still allowing tax deductibility for local organisations that make direct or indirect financial contributions to settlements. Accountability is not about the leaders alone. Malaysia raised the question of dual citizens. Anyone who has served in the Israeli Defence Forces in Gaza since October 2023 must be considered a suspect for the commission of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of genocide. The issue of accountability extends beyond warrants issued by the International Criminal Court. And speaking of that court, what has been done to support the court while it is under attack from the United States? What has been done to support the Special Rapporteur? The attention now must move beyond concern and condemnation to action.
I thank the members of the Commission of Inquiry. This brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I wish to thank the members once again for their participation and their contribution. We will now take a short break before holding the interactive dialogue on the annual report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights.